Hello and welcome to The Analyst, dated 25th July 2023 by Vajiram and Ravi, wherein we will be covering the important current affairs article from both The Hindu as well as Indian Express. And the handout of this very discussion would be available to you in the description below. So let's have a look over the articles that we are going to cover today. So firstly, we'll be trying to understand that what all steps we need to take in order to reduce the risk of disaster. Then we'll be looking into this concept of gig economy. Then we'll try to understand the India-Sri Lanka relations. Then we'll be looking into the Gyanvapi issue. And lastly, we'll try to understand the issue of suspension of MPs. So let's begin. So the first article is related to this very topic of your GS paper 3 syllabus, and we also have a previous year question in this regard. So try and attempt this previous year question. Let's try and understand the context. So the context is, as we know that right now a lot of the regions across the world are witnessing various types of disaster. For example, we are witnessing forest fires in the regions of Greece as well as Canada. The European region witnessed heat waves recently. We are witnessing urban flood situations as well in Delhi region itself on account of rise in the water levels in the Yamuna river. So in this background, the writer is asking us that the world now needs to focus on reducing the risk of disaster rather than paying more attention and spending more on disaster response. So now in this regard, the first thing that we need to understand is, what is a disaster management cycle? So it consists of various phases which enables us to manage the disaster as well as response to disaster effectively. Now it has various stages. So the first stage is the prevention stage. This is something which comes pre-disaster. So now in prevention stage, basically we try to prevent the disaster. For example, activities like relocating the people as well as assets from a region which is more prone to a particular disaster. For example, region A is more prone to floods. Shifting the people and the infrastructure development to region B, which is less prone to floods. Okay, so this would be coming under the prevention activities. Then we also have mitigation stage, wherein we try to develop the disaster resilient infrastructure. For example, we can build earthquake resistance or earthquake resilient infrastructure in a region which is more prone to earthquake, or you can plant trees in a region which is more prone to landslides. So these activities come under the mitigation measures. Then another stage which is also pre-disaster, that is the preparedness stage, wherein comes the early warning system, carrying out emergency mock drills, then identifying the evacuation routes. So in this preparation stage, basically we prepare the community for a disaster. Then comes the response stage. This stage comes after a disaster has already taken place. So what do we actually do when a disaster takes place? We carry out evacuation exercises. We mobilize the emergency services, like we make health services available to the victims of natural disaster. We provide temporary shelters to them. We avail food to the victims of a natural disaster, etc. All these steps come under the response phase. The last stage is the recovery stage, wherein let's suppose this region A was impacted by flood. So under this recovery phase, what we will be ensuring is that this region A could again be returned to its pre-disaster stage. Okay, so in this we will be carrying out the reconstruction of damaged infrastructure like road, power supply, etc. And we would also be ensuring rehabilitation of the victims of those disasters. Okay, so that we could ensure that they are able to earn sustainable livelihood. So all these steps come under the recovery stage of disaster management cycle. Now the next aspect that we need to understand in this regard is, what is risk reduction and what all steps are there in this risk reduction. So through these steps, we can minimize the risk of disaster. First is risk identification. How do you identify a risk? In this, we collect the data that let's suppose this is region A, this is region B. So we'll be collecting historical data, geographical data, topographical data, hydrological data, etc. and historical data as well. From that, we'll try to figure it out that, okay, when it comes to region A, which natural disaster it is prone to. When it comes to region B, which natural disaster it is prone to. Okay. So based on this collection of data, we identify the risk in a particular region. That means we figure out that, okay, this region is more prone to a particular natural disaster. That is risk identification. Now, as you have identified the risk, we go for risk reduction. How we do risk reduction? Through preventive as well as mitigation measures that we discuss right now. Then comes the preparedness. So on account of, effective early warning system, India was able to minimize the death casualties when the Biparjoy cyclone hit the western coast of India. And it was on account of preparedness of our power sector that we were able to resume the power supply in a very short period of time. So preparedness have a very important role to play when it comes to risk reduction. And in this regard, we need to come up with multi-hazard early warning systems. Okay, so that we could anticipate that which disaster is going to impact which region of a particular nation. Then comes the financial protection. It basically relates to coming up with insurance, okay, for the losses which we incur on account of a natural disaster. So in this, the private players, the financial and insurance companies need to come forward so that we could minimize the losses which a person undergoes on account of a natural disaster. Then building disaster resilient infrastructure. In this regard, we have coalition of disaster resilient infrastructure, which is a very good step forward. So we need to ensure effective implementation of this, and we need to make sure that based on the hazard zonation mapping that we have with regard to different hazards, we build disaster resilient infrastructure in accordance to the hazard which is more common in a particular region. So these all steps we need to take in order to reduce the risk of disaster. Then let's have a look over the other steps that we need to take in order to reduce the risk of disaster. First and foremost, we need to come up with such kind of risk information which is understandable to the people who are living in a particular region. For example, region A. Because if this risk information is not comprehensible to the people who are living in that region, we would not be able to get the people's participation when it comes to preventing or mitigating the impact of a particular disaster. If this risk information is comprehensible to the people who are living in a particular region, then they could also take adequate measures. For example, if a region is more prone to drought, then the farmers in that region, if they understand this thing, then they would be growing disaster resilient crops. If a region is more prone to landslide, then the farmers there can practice terrace farming. So, in order to get the people's participation when it comes to preventing and mitigating the impacts of a disaster, we need to come up with such risk information which is comprehensible or understandable to the people who are living in that particular region. Then, we need to enhance international cooperation as well. We need to come up with multi-hazard early warning systems and which are open to everyone, which are available to the least developing nations as well. And in this regard, the developed countries should provide the developing nations with the requisite climate finance and the requisite climate adaptation and mitigation technologies as well. Okay, so that the different nations could together take adequate measures when it comes to reducing the impacts of disaster. Then we need to invest in disaster management. Herein both the private players as well as government needs to come forward and they need to come up with insurance tools, okay, so that we could cover the losses which a person undergoes on account of a natural disaster. Then Last aspect is we need to improve disaster governance as well. In this regard, we need to understand the role of local governments, because they are the first one to respond whenever a natural disaster takes place in a particular region. So we need to ensure the participation of the local governments as well whenever we are chalking out disaster management plans. And we need to enhance the cooperation between different ministries and different agencies which are basically working in the domain of disaster management. This is all that we need to know with regard to this article. Let's move to the next one. Now, this next article relates to the issue of gig economy, and this topic pertains to this very topic of your GS paper 3 syllabus. Let's try and understand the context. So the context is, recently Rajasthan has become the first state to pass a platform-based gig workers bill. In this regard, the first thing that we need to understand is, what is gig economy? Gig economy is a place wherein an individual engages in such livelihood which are outside the traditional employee-employer relationship. This is the definition which has been given by the Niti Aayog in its report. Again, according to Niti Aayog, in 2020-21, we had around 7.7 million workers who were working in this gig economy. And according to Niti Aayog, it is expected that this gig economy would be expanding by 2030. This gig economy basically includes your workers like the delivery boys of Swiggy, Zomato, Ola, Uber drivers, etc., which basically connects to you through a software or through a platform. Okay. Now, the next aspect that we need to understand with regard to this article is, what are the growth drivers when it comes to gig economy in India? Why are we witnessing the growth of this gig economy in India? The first reason is increased internet penetration. According to Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, India has around 1.2 billion mobile phone users. And right now we know that internet rates have gone down. So on account of cheap internet rates also, we are witnessing increased internet penetration in India. This has given a boost to the gig economy in India because it is mostly platform based work. Then on account of economic liberalization, we have allowed the companies to compete with each other, and this is the result of this competition that we are witnessing product innovation and this changes in the work culture as well that we are witnessing right now when it comes to the gig economy. So on account of economic liberalization as well, we are witnessing this growth in the gig economy. Then on account of changing work culture, we know that after COVID-19 pandemic, work from home has become a new normal. And women prefer to work in this gig economy. Why? Because it gives them the requisite flexibility which they require in order to balance their professional as well as personal lives. So this is also one of the factor which is resulting in growth of gig economy in India. Then on account of growth of e-commerce, today nobody wants to go to a grocery store and buy products. We rather prefer to sit in our homes and order products from e-commerce. Now on account of this, we have witnessed growth in the delivery and logistics services. This is the reason that majority of the gig workers are engaged in the retail and sales sector. So this has also given a boost to the gig economy in India. Now let's try and understand the advantages of this economy. First is cost effectiveness. This is primarily from the perspective of the companies. See, now on account of this gig economy, the companies are able to connect to off-site workers. So they do not have to build expensive workplaces. They do not have to provide paid leaves to the worker. They do not have to provide the gig workers with employee protection, or benefits. So on account of this cost cutting, it is very cost effective for the companies. Then it has a positive impact on output production as well. How come? Because the youth today demands a flexible working culture. Okay. So now, since in this gig economy they are getting that flexible working culture, this has a positive impact on the output production and product innovation as well. Then flexibility. What happens in a gig economy? The company would be giving a task A to an individual B with a deadline. And now it is up to this individual B to work in accordance to his own preferences, and he has to finish this work within this given deadline. Okay, there is no strict working hours. So on account of this flexibility, the youth is more attracted towards this gig economy because it gives them the requisite flexibility. And this is also one of the case with the female workforce. Then it enables the youth to generate extra income as well, because there is no strict working hours. So you can work based on your own preferences. This is the reason that, a lot of people who belong to humble background, who are studying in colleges, they work as delivery boys in Zomato or Swiggy, they work as Ola or Uber drivers in their free time. So this enables them to generate extra income as well. So these all are the advantages of gig economy. Let's look at the challenges which the gig workers face in India. First and foremost is the lack of job security. We know that when it comes to gig economy, the workers are hired on a contractual basis. So what happens? Let's take an example. If a delivery boy fails to meet his or her weekly target, then the company can fire that particular delivery boy. So the gig workers basically lack job security. They do not have effective bargaining power as well to get better wages and to get better flexibility when it comes to the working hours as well. Although they are provided with flexibility, but they are provided with such strict targets that they actually turn up working for more number of hours. Why? Because they lack job security. They know that if they fail to meet the target, then another person could be hired by the company itself. Then they also lack social security, as we discussed right now. Why this gig economy is cost effective for the companies? Because it does not have to pay the paid leaves to the worker or employee benefits to the worker. And this ultimately leads to lack of social security for the gig workers. They do not have accidental insurance or health insurance, etc., which is basically availed to a permanent employee in an organization. Then there are payment issues as well. So majority of the time, the workers who are working in this gig economy, they get delayed payments or very less wages as well. Because as I told you, there are a lot of people who are ready to work at that limited wage. So there is, on account of this lack of bargaining power and more number of people who are available to work at that wage, this leads to lower payment, and one issue is delayed payments when it comes to the gig economy. This is the major issue with a lot of freelancers as well. Then they also lack access to training and development programs. What happens if an employee is a permanent employee for organization? Time and again the organization organizes training programs. But when it comes to gig workers, the corporations or the organizations do not carry out such training exercises for them. So this ultimately reduces the future growth prospects of the gig workers. So these all are the challenges which the gig workers faced in India. Let's have a look over the key provisions of the bill which was introduced by the Rajasthan State Legislative Assembly. Now, the bill that has been passed by the Rajasthan State Legislative Assembly, it has created a welfare board, which would be having two primary tasks. First is the registration of the gig workers, the platform aggregators, etc. And secondly, to formulate social security schemes. That is how we can provide accidental insurance to the gig workers, how we can provide health insurance to the gig workers, etc. Then it also talks about creation of a welfare fund. Initially, it is having the corpus of 200 crore. Okay, 200 crore rupees. And in this welfare fund, the money would be coming from state governments, from gig workers as well. and also from the platform aggregators. So when it comes to the welfare fund, the platform aggregators have to provide this welfare cess, which would be around 1% to 2% of the value of each transaction. So this amount of money they have to put in the welfare fund, which would be ultimately used to provide social security to the gig workers. Then it also ensures the accountability of platform aggregators. If they fail to update the database of the gig workers, or if they fail to provide the welfare cess on time, then the penalties would be imposed on the platform aggregators. Now, what more needs to be done in order to enhance the welfare of gig workers in India? First and foremost, we need to enforce this Social Security Code 2020, which is already in place, but it is not being enforced in majority of the states. So other state governments need to learn from Rajasthan state, and they should also implement this Social Security Code 2020. Then the state should provide financial assistance to the gig worker, the way Rajasthan is doing through its welfare fund. And lastly, the state should also organize training programs, because as we discussed that the corporations usually do not organize training exercises for the gig workers. So herein comes the role of the state. They should organize training programs so that the gig workers could enhance their skill set, and this could ultimately improve their growth prospects in the upcoming future. This is all that we need to know with regard to this article. Let's move to the next one. Now this next article relates to India-Sri Lanka relations, and this topic pertains to this very topic of your GS paper 2 syllabus. We also have a previous year question in this regard. So after listening to this discussion, try and attempt this very question. Let's try and understand the context. So the context is, recently India and Sri Lanka issued a joint statement on economic cooperation. Let's look into the India-Sri Lanka relation by understanding the different dimensions when it comes to India-Sri Lanka relation. First is the political relation. So time and again we have seen that the leaders of the two nations and the diplomats of the two nations pay visits to each other nations. And when the Sri Lankan government was taking actions against this LTTE, then the Indian government supported the Sri Lankan government in this regard. And the two nations are also cooperating on regional forums like SAARC and BIMSTEC. When it comes to defense cooperation, the two nations are carrying out military exercises like Mitra Shakti and naval exercises like SLINX. When it comes to developmental cooperation, India is building houses under the Model Village Housing Project. It is building Jaffna Cultural Center, etc. And under this recent economic cooperation joint statement, India is going to develop ports and airports in Sri Lankan region. It is going to connect the Tamil Nadu region with the northern and eastern provinces of Sri Lanka through enhancing airport connectivity, and it would also be building renewable energy projects like wind and solar energy projects in Sri Lanka. When it comes to economic cooperation, we have a free trade agreement with Sri Lanka, and under this recent joint statement on economic cooperation, the two nations have signed a MOU to promote UPI digital payments in Sri Lankan region, and they have also agreed to use Indian rupee as the currency for carrying out bilateral trade. When it comes to cultural relation, Buddhism is the major factor on account of which we see better cultural relation as well as better people-to-people ties as well. And this is the reason that when it comes to the relations between India and Sri Lanka in the cultural domain, it dates back to 2500 years. And time and again, these two nations also organize cultural exchange programs as well. Now, let's have a look over the issues which are there between the two nations. First is the China factor. We know that Sri Lanka has endorsed the Belt and Road Initiative of China, and previously the Sri Lankan government leased the development of Hambantota port to Chinese companies. In this regard, India raised certain concerns, and recently the Chinese satellite tracking vessel Yuang Wang 5, when it reached the Hambantota port, India raised concern in this regard. So it highlights that Sri Lanka has, better relation with China as compared to India. The Chinese influence is more when it comes to the Sri Lankan region. Then there is fishermen issues also between the two nations. Why? On account of proximity of the territorial waters of the two nations, especially when it comes to Pak State and Gulf of Mannar, which leads to arrest of fishermen. So what happens? Since the fishermen in their fishing vessels, they do not have effective tracking system. So at times they cross the international maritime boundary line and ultimately they get arrested by the the coastal police which is there of the different nation. Then another issue is ethnic issue. The 13th amendment to the Sri Lankan constitution was a result of an agreement between India and Sri Lanka in 1987. This amendment basically talked about giving greater provincial autonomy to the northern and eastern provinces. It talked about giving land and police powers to the provincial councils in this particular provinces. But even today, the Sri Lankan government has not effectively implemented this 13th constitutional amendment which was done to the Sri Lankan constitution. Why? Because it is the Tamils who are residing in the northern and the eastern provinces of Sri Lanka, which are basically the minority in Sri Lanka. And that is the reason time and again we witness conflict between the Sinhala majority community and the Tamil minority community. And this is one of the major reasons that Sri Lankan government has yet not implemented this 13th constitutional amendment to the Sri Lankan constitution. In this regard also India has raised concern because Tamils are very important when it comes to the Indian region, okay? Because Tamils are also there in Tamil Nadu region. So we have greater people to people and cultural ties in that regard as well. Now, what needs to be done in order to improve the relation between the two nations? The two nations should effectively use the regional forums of which they are member like SAARC and BIMSTEC. Then when it comes to the China factor, Sri Lanka should take into consideration India's concern when it comes to increasing Chinese presence. Why? Because recently when Sri Lanka was witnessing economic crisis, it was largely due to the debt trap diplomacy of China when it comes to developing this Hambantota port. And in this background, India provided line of credit to Sri Lanka. So given this background, Sri Lanka should take into account the India's concern when it comes to increasing Chinese presence in the Sri Lankan region. When it comes to the fishermen issue, the two nations should come forward, they should coordinate with each other. The coastal police of both the nations should coordinate better. Patrolling should be done in a coordinated manner. And the two nations, the government should put in place effective tracking system in the fishing vessels so that the fishermen do not cross the international maritime boundary line. When it comes to ethnic issue, Sri Lanka should give effect to this 13th constitutional amendment which was done to the Sri Lankan constitution. This is all that we need to know with regard to this article. Let's move to the next one. Now this next article relates to Gyanvapi issue and this article relates to this very topic of your prelim syllabus. Let's try and understand the context. So the context is, recently the Supreme Court has stayed the Archaeological Survey of India scientific survey at Gyanvapi Mosque till tomorrow evening, so that in the meanwhile the mosque committee could go and appeal in the Allahabad High Court against the order of the Varanasi District Court, which has basically ordered the scientific survey of Gyanvapi Mosque. Now let's try and understand the background of the case. It is a popular belief that Aurangzeb in 1669 demolished the Vishweshwar temple and it was the place where the Gyanvapi Mosque was built. And this is something which finds mention in Saqib Khan's book Yasir Alamgiri. Now the background is that 4 women claim the right to worship Ma Gauri, which is there in the outer complex of Gyanvapi Mosque. And majority of the people of Hindu belief, they have this belief that a Shivalinga is present beneath this Gyanvapi mosque. However, the mosque committee has in its on its side, it has stated that in accordance with the Places of Worship Act, you cannot change the character of the place of worship. Now in this regard, the next thing that you need to understand is what is this carbon dating, which basically refers to the scientific survey. Now when the cosmic rays from the sun collides with nitrogen 14, because it has neutron in it, it leads to creation of carbon 14 with one proton left. Now when the plants or the animals, they intake carbon dioxide, they also take carbon 14. And when the organic mammals or the plants, they basically die, the C14 remains constant at that time. Okay, they stop absorbing the C14 from the atmosphere. Now, based on the amount of this C14 in a particular organic material, we are able to guess the age of that organic material. Why? Because this C14, which is a radioactive isotope of carbon, it decays at a predictable rate. Okay. Now today, let's suppose there is 100% of C14 in a dead matter, okay, in a dead organic material. After 5,730 years, it would become 50%. So every 5,730 years, it becomes half of the value. So based on this, we are able to calculate the age of a organic material. But this carbon dating could not be used to figure out the age of rocks or minerals, and it could be used if the organic material is less than 50,000 years old. Now the last thing that we need to know is the Place of Worship Act 1991. According to this very act, we are not allowed to convert the religious character of any place of worship as it existed on 15th August 1947. One exception to this is the Ayodhya dispute. Ram Janambhoomi dispute. Okay. Apart from that, no place of worship, its religious character could be changed. Okay. So whatever was the religious character of a particular place of worship on 15th August 1947, that would remain to continue. This is all that we need to know with regard to this article. Let's move to the next one. Now this last article pertains to suspension of MP, and this relates to this very topic of your prelim syllabus. Let's try and understand the context. So the context is, recently the Aam Aadmi Party MP, that is Sanjay Singh, was suspended by the Rajya Sabha chairman. In this regard, you need to understand that it is the role of the presiding officer of each of the house to maintain decorum in the house, so that the house could smoothly carry out its functioning. But if there is ruckus, or if a particular MP is behaving in a disorderly manner, then the rules of procedure of both the house gives certain powers to the presiding officer of that particular house. When it comes to Lok Sabha, the speaker can suspend an MP by naming a particular MP that this MP is, behaving in a disorderly manner, or he or she is abusing the chair. But when it comes to Rajya Sabha, the chairman cannot simply suspend an MP by naming that MP, that this person is abusing the chair or this person is showing disorderly behavior in the house. It is only the house which can pass a motion in this regard. But when it comes to the Lok Sabha, speaker can suspend a MP of Lok Sabha if that MP is behaving in a disorderly manner by simply naming that MP. But when it comes to revoking the suspension of an MP, in that regard, it is only the house in both the cases, in both the Lok Sabha as well as Rajya Sabha, which can, by again introducing a motion, can do away with the suspension of a particular MP. Now the next thing that you need to understand is the terms of suspension. So an MP or an MLA could be suspended for a maximum period of the remaining part of that particular session. For example, in this case, as you can see, that this Aam Aadmi Party leader Sanjay Singh has been suspended for the remaining part of the monsoon session itself. When a MP is suspended, then he cannot attend the meetings of parliamentary committees. He cannot introduce a notice in the House to raise a particular issue, etc. And next aspect is whether the court can intervene in this regard. According to Article 122 of the Indian Constitution, the courts are debarred from inquiring into the parliamentary proceedings as well as proceeding of the parliamentary committees. But recently, when in the monsoon session of 2021 of Maharashtra State Legislative Assembly, when 12 BJP MLAs were suspended for 1 year, then in this regard, the courts came into picture and the Supreme Court basically declared this resolution of Maharashtra State Legislative Assembly as unconstitutional, stating that you can suspend a MLA for a maximum period of remaining part of that particular session, not for an entire year. Now, the last thing that you need to understand is why time and again we witness that MPs are being suspended. One reason is, at times it has been witnessed that the presiding officer, especially the speaker in case of Lok Sabha and the speaker in case of State Legislative Assembly, they work in a partisan manner. They do not allow the MPs or MLAs belonging to opposition political party to raise a particular matter of public importance. Secondly, at times, the presiding officer do not give adequate time to the MPs to raise their concerns or to raise their views with regard to a particular issue. And lastly, since the presiding officer do not take adequate actions against such unruly behavior, against such MPs who are doing unruly behavior in the House, that is also one of the reasons that we are witnessing suspension of MPs. We are witnessing unruly behavior in the House. And lastly, we are witnessing that since the ruling government has absolute majority in the House, it is not allowing the opposition political party to raise or to discuss certain issues in the House. That is also one of the reasons recently that we are witnessing in the Lok Sabha when it comes to the Manipur issue. So since the ruling government has the absolute majority, it is not allowing the opposition political party MPs to raise certain issues of great public importance. On account of that, the opposition political party MPs are basically resorting to disorderly behavior in the House, which ultimately leads to suspension of MPs. That is all that we need to know from today's article, from today's newspaper as well. Thank you for listening to the discussion and all the very best for your preparation.